Okay. Righto team, we've got 2 agenda items that have come up, so just a welcome for those that are listening in and those that are already in the chamber. I have apologies from Councillor Lardley, who's overseas. So somebody like to move? Peter, thank you, and Barry. All those in favour?
Aye.
Carried. I take it there's no declaration of interest, given that we've just had a previous meeting. So the first submission is in relation to the government policy and the emergency works investment policies. Aaron, are you going to briefly speak to that? Yep, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Chair. This is one that we had received notification from the NZTA around some changes to their provisions around funding when we have an emergency event. The paper outlines the changes to the funding. I think the key piece of concern for us is that this is another space where I guess there's a tightening of funding from central government and where there's been oversubscription previously to their fund in response to, I guess, higher levels of emergency events and councils seeking funding. They're looking to drop that back by essentially requiring councils to step in earlier and to a greater extent when we do have emergency events. So that's obviously a concern from a staff perspective, and we expect from a council perspective, as that's an additional risk to us to funding at a time when we're seeing an increasing number of these events. Happy to take any questions.
Yep. So just a reflection from my perspective, to start this ball rolling, this is just another example of government pushing back on us, costs which they would normally have incurred. Interesting that local government New Zealand has challenged the government in 2 areas, which if they're successful, I'm not sure they will be, but if they are, will help, and that was the issue that government buildings in the city should pay rates like everybody else, and that we should get some degree of return on GST from rates as well, which might give us more money to do it. When I consider what other councils have got in reserves, which is our net debt, I guess, and what we've got sitting in the bank, we're in a far better position to deal with an emergency than many councils have, who are, and some of our local colleagues very close to their spending limits. So if they have a major disaster, they're in serious trouble. So yeah, open to questions on that. Yeah, Tom.
Will this change your insurance strategy?
It's a good question. I might ask Patricia to provide any thoughts on that potential.
We'll consider it as we go through. Roads we never actually insure anyway, so to the extent it's roading, that's always been, we've had to fund that a portion of it. For the others, we'll consider it as when we have a look at the insurance at renewal.
Thank you.
Ringy.
Thank you, Chair. Look, just clarifying, is this referring only to roading? Because I noticed in our submission that it talks about 419k of stormwater pipe, 380k of wastewater pipe, etc. So is that piping that's under roads or attached to roads, but not necessarily piping that sits outside of a road corridor?
That's right. So whilst we include those additional networks that obviously run under the road corridor, this is around funding to replace the actual physical road structure. However, that network infrastructure, water pipes, etc., that we have under the roads, when we have an emergency event, often that they are a contributing factor to the damage to the road. So for example, say we had a shake, we might find that there is significantly more damage from the loss of, loss of service from a water pipe, which then lets go under the road, which creates significant damage to the road structure itself.
So my final question is in regards to, is this purely with weather events and does it relate to earthquake related events?
Would include any of those types of emergency events, whether it be earthquake, flood, etc.
Because it reads quite specifically as weather events.
And I think that's because we've been specifically speaking about, we're not in a zone where we would expect to be at high risk from earthquake. The risks that we generally see in Southland are more around the flood events.
Okay, so we've done an analysis then of AF8 and what effect that would have, considering the next 50 years, 75% chance AF8.
So we haven't done significant analysis at ICC around AF8. Usually we would base that off the analysis that's done from an emergency management perspective. And at this stage we don't have, a significant, we have a just into the medium risk in that space and not a high risk.
Thanks.
No other further questions? Oh, sorry, Emma.
Through you, the question of the other types of infrastructure, we don't have as much as some places do, but we do have a couple of dams and locks and things like that. What is the risk level on those? So on the Waihopai and places like that where we actually do have some of that infrastructure, we don't really talk about it, but I guess this reminds me that we do have it.
Are you simply talking about if we had an earthquake event, for example, would our reservoirs be robust, etc., or are you talking about flood events?
I'm going back to flood events because when 84, that was one of the areas where considerable flooding came from because of the log jams, the literal log jams that were there. But I mean, in terms of the risk of failure of that particular structure, I haven't even asked, and perhaps I should have.
So there is a piece of work that Environment Southland are doing, who obviously own the majority of that flood-related infrastructure. We have a small amount of it, for example, with the Stead Street Stop Bank, but most of it sits within the ownership of Environment Southland. They are, as I think the council have heard, they have been doing a piece of work around data from flood event, and then they need to do a piece of work around analysis of that, which is, as I understand it, feeding into their plans for what they need to do from an infrastructure perspective moving forward. As I understand it, we've fed back some concerns around whether or not that work is progressing at a sufficient pace, which I would suggest that we would like that work to go a bit faster than what it currently is.
So that we don't own it, it just is within our floodplain protections.
So the majority of the flood-related infrastructure is owned by the Regional Council, that's right.
Thank you.
Just for your benefit, on the first page of the submission that we're putting in, it reads critical assets. They are defined as those that have a high consequence of failure, but not necessarily a high probability of failure. To a layperson, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But I guess what they're trying to say there, and what Andrew would say if he was doing his risk assessment, is to say that the chance of it failing is pretty low, but if it does fail, the consequences are high. Yep. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, sorry, Tom.
I guess just listening to some of their questions, and as I understand it, so this is a question, so as I understand it, the biggest change is the reducing the enhanced FAR from a 1 in 20 year event, from a 1 in 10 year event to a 1 in 20 year event.
Yep.
So now we are covering the difference between 1 in 10 and 1 in 20.
Yep.
Whereas some of the sort of catastrophic things that could occur, like AF8 for example, these are not, these are not 1 in 10 and 1 in 20, these are 1 in 20,000 or something. So
1 in 300.
Yeah, so 1 in 300. So, it kind of takes it outside that. So, am I right in thinking that it is actually, as I read this, it's that gap between the 10 and 20 years where we...
It results in, I guess, council having no support from central government around a greater number of events, as it would be longer before those a greater severity of event before central government would provide funding. And the other piece is that the actual funding being provided would also reduce.
So given that Gisborne's just had an event, if it were to have one in the next 10 years or 20 years, are they going to be disadvantaged? Is that the way the government will play it out?
So it comes down to, again, to that risk exposure piece of whether it's an event could happen in, say, 2 years' time. Is it deemed to be a 1 in 10 year severity event, or is it deemed to be a 1 in 20 year severity event? Previously, if it was deemed a 1 in 10, funding would be contributed. Going forward under this change, if it was deemed a 1 in 10, no funding would be provided from central government.
Excellent. All right, any further questions? There being none, we have 2 recommendations. One, that we receive the report, and secondly, we approve the attached submission, which is sitting in Appendix 1.
Happy to move that
A
one.
mover, Leslie, and a seconder, Trish. All those in favour?
Aye.
Carried. And on to the second piece, which is local government water services preliminary arrangements bill submission. So this is the submission that's currently going through the select committee process at the moment. Welcome, the floor is yours.
Excuse me. Yes, thanks very much. So I know that this analysis and the draft submission was only distributed last night, so it's quite a bit of information to get your heads around. It's really a product of a very, very short consultation period that's been provided to us. The bill was only released on the 30th. We received and collated that information. A submission needs to be submitted, if we all agree, on that submission by the 13th of June. So that's literally 2 days away, Thursday. I'm happy to step through any feedback that you may have in terms of questions, in terms of the analysis or the submission. I'm happy to take it as read. But,
Tom.
So, I was happy with the submission, Chair. One question I had though was related to Te Mana o Te Wai, if I've got that pronunciation correct, where in the table the ICC submission point suggested that we ask whether this was intended, and then request that the change be reconsidered. Whereas when I come to the actual submission, it simply asks whether it was intended, and doesn't go on in the second part of the sentence, which was ask for it to be reinstated. So I just wondered whether that was just an oversight, or whether it was intended to be written that way. The other question I had was the implications of that RO to us, because I don't really understand that particular clause. The main point was just to wonder why it said one thing in the table, but then actually the submission said something different.
yeah, so that was in haste.
I'm happy to speak to that, Andrew.
Sure.
That was actually a deliberate change from my perspective. So the actual table there is essentially to provide some additional commentary to council, whereas the submission is what we would actually be sending off. The reason for the change in that one was that the original commentary, I guess, went a little bit further around whether or not we should be providing an opinion on whether they had done the right thing or not. I felt that we were more likely just be wanting to point out that there was an inconsistency rather than give our opinion on whether that was right or wrong.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Rangi.
Thank you, Chair. Look, it's really my questions in regards to how this new Water Services Bill actually fits in with our current Local Government Act. And there's a couple of parts of the Act that are quite specific on the way we deliver services, and one is Section 17A, and that requires local authorities to review the cost effectiveness for the delivery of good quality infrastructure. Now, is that 17A? Are we still alive and well with that? when are we doing ours in regards to Three Waters?
I'd have to take that away to delve into. Yeah, I don't have.
Because it
that
really
at hand.
holds councils accountable. And the other one is the 30-year infrastructure plan. So, I mean, basically 30 years makes a council, look at the future needs, looks at its current infrastructure, its depreciation, setting budgets, renewals, and everything like that. I mean, that's the 30-year plan done correctly. I mean, we wouldn't have the problems now that we have in New Zealand. The fact that it's not audited is a separate issue. So I'm just wondering where this bill, I mean, you got an act that actually tells you what to do, and then you got this bill we're commenting on, and I can't quite come to grips on where this government is coming from.
I'm happy to respond to that,
Sure,
Chair.
yeah.
I think one of the criticisms that we would have of the legislation is that it's definitely lacking in detail. It's very much back to what we saw in the very first version of the Water Services Bill, where essentially a framework was put in place that lacked the detail around how it integrated with other legislation, as well as that finer detail around exactly what local authorities would need to do to actually comply with the legislation in practice. We're seeing that similarly here with a lot of placeholders for detail to come later, and in particular they don't seem to have that. The previous piece of legislation has reinstated the Local Government Act, but this legislation hasn't really addressed how it would integrate with the Local Government Act. So the requirement to develop the water services plans doesn't really talk about then how it would interact with 30-year infrastructure strategies, how it would interact with the long-term plan, and absolutely things like Section 17A reviews. We're absolutely still finding our way through based on, I guess, the mandate from, or the direction from central government around needing to review our services and look at where we may have regional collaboration as part of developing those water service delivery plans.
Okay.
Anyone?
So a couple of things, just for clarification for me. Looking at the chart, and I'm not sure what page that is, the first page of the chart thing. The fact that we're going into green infrastructure, or we've been moving towards that, so sort of the sort of sponges type thing, are we not going to be allowed to do that, or is it just not mentioned in this and we're unclear as to how it will be covered by this piece of legislation? Is that what you're indicating to us?
Yes, the latter. It appears to not be encapsulating that green infrastructure, whether it be things like that, or whether it simply be overland flow paths, etc. I think it's possibly a little bit of a remnant of the fact that under the previous Three Waters entities, there was an intention that that type of green infrastructure would stay with councils as opposed to moving to the entities. I'm not sure whether it's been a deliberate piece in this that it's foreseeing that there may be a movement more towards CCOs, and therefore an expectation that that green infrastructure piece would remain with local authorities as opposed to transitioning.
Okay, so the next thing is, it will come as no surprise to anybody that I am actually quite concerned about disregarding the hierarchy of priorities under Te Mana or Te Wai. That would seem to me a serious backwards move, and I really would like to encourage our council to be quite as forceful as we feel we are able to be with that, because we're talking quite a lot about water quality, which includes things like the New River Estuary, and if we actually allow this degradation of the hierarchy to go ahead, that means that this is all a waste of time. Waterways can be as degraded as you like because this is what the government is saying, so Taumata Arawai is supposed to guarantee us good standards of potable water and all those sorts of things. If the places that we're taking the water from are of not good quality in the first place, how are we going to provide our citizens with affordable quality potable water? If we've got to treat it up the wazoo, that is not actually what we thought we were aiming for. So that's that. And then I think also, because we exist within the takiwa of Ngaitahu, who has a treaty settlement, we need to make sure that we do actually remind the government that it is really important that clarity is around what the settlement obligations are, because that's not something you can contract out of, as I understand it. It's an act of Parliament, and you can't just say, I'm not going to take any notice of it. So thank you for that.
Barry?
Yeah, as far as, it's got clause 19 here, and then it comes up with, Evelyn was talking about it, in the treaty settlements. I'd like some clarity on what that actually means to Joe Ordinary in the street, because it's not very clear to me.
Well, I might be able to help a little bit in that respect. Evelyn said we have an act that in 1998 that declared the settlement with Ngaitahu. Like any piece of legislation, it can be changed, so we just need to be mindful of that. The current coalition government has acts mandate that the three parties have agreed to, and that is they will remove Treaty of Waitangi reference from all pieces of legislation on the assumption that the rights of iwi within the treaty are established. It doesn't need to be reiterated in every single piece of legislation that comes around. Now, there'll be people around this table that disagree with that, but that's the position of the coalition government, and this is part of the attempt to do that, is to remove that specific thing. What they're basically saying is our obligations under current law and settlements are there, and this piece of water does not, this piece of legislation and a whole lot that come down the track will not need to have that reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. In fact, they're actually going to proactively take it out of some of the current legislation as well. Now, whether you agree with that or you don't agree with that, that's the card that we were dealt post the election.
I think the only piece I'd add to that is, I think what the part of the reference to this point was that previously when we talked about joint government-owned entities, there was a clarity around the applicability of treaty obligations to those entities.
Sure.
This was simply around that the legislation doesn't include that for any joint entities, that clarity for any joint entities going forward.
So, again, the wording of this is quite open-ended, and this is, I guess, what ACT in particular, but the coalition are thinking, that when you say a treaty settlement obligation and any other existing rights or interests, that opens a very wide parameter. So for argument's sake, it opens up who owns fresh water.
In court.
And that's the debate they don't want in every single piece of legislation. It'll come, because I know the tribes will take that case on somewhere along the line, and so be it. But they just don't want to open up every single piece of legislation for that benefit. Ria.
Mr. Chair, I'm just listening to that vision of what a coalition government will or might be doing. I'm just really quite a little bit nervous about saying words that they will remove all prior treaty settlements. They do not and cannot do that legislatively. That's actually already been looked at through the courts. I don't think that would be helpful to this process when we have our mana whenua here with the Ngātahu treaty settlement that we can't actually undo.
Well, I understand that.
So,
Yeah.
but other people in the room didn't understand that. They took that to be that the treaty settlements with Ngātahu or any other treaty settlement in this country that we've passed through that house
Yep.
will not be undone.
No.
It's the only treaty settlement that's not actually passed at the moment is with my iwi and my hapu, Ngāti Hine, Ngāpui. So we can't take away what the government's already ruled on and what's being passed under legislation, but what we can do, and this is the bits that's changing through legislation, being referred to by the coalition, is what they would like considerations to have changes for in the future.
Yep. So,
But we can't
so
undo
what-
previous legislation to
Yep.
treaty claims.
So what ACT is saying, and being duplicated by the coalition government, is we already have a statute in
It can
place.
say that, but
that-
whether they get it passed is a different thing.
Well, that's another issue again. Yeah, Tom?
So I was just going to say that, I mean, to me, this is a matter for central government, and all we have asked in our submission is that they clarify the position, which I would have thought was the right position for us to take.
Sure.
Not a matter for local government to determine.
Yep. Yep. Leslie?
Thank you. I would have thought that clauses 4, 5, 24, 25, 26, 27 and 29
way
of
too
our
fast.
submission have raised these issues in exactly the form that we intended them to be raised, and that we have actually, according to our submission, asked for speaking rights for an oral submission. Therefore, we can back up any of the points we have put in our submission, and I would think that those are points. Okay, so 4 and 5, if people are finding it hard to find, deals with the green implications.
Yep.
And 24 to 27 deal with Te Mana o Te Wai and the treaty settlement obligations. 29 deals with the whole host of things that we're suggesting are listed areas that could be considered for inclusion in the current bill, because they're basically causing some disquiet by not being referred to. So I would have thought, having asked for oral submissions, that our oral submitter would expand on all those important issues to emphasise our points.
Yep.
I actually thought it was a good submission, considering the lack of time there has been to put it together. I compliment you on putting together a good submission and giving the ability for an oral submitter to emphasise those important points.
Any other questions? I'll ring you.
Yeah, look, I actually forgot about the oral submission. Can I ask the committee who would be doing that on behalf of staff?
So that's exactly right. That was one of the pieces we would come to at the end, was to discuss who, confirm if council would like to make an oral submission, and if council would, who would be making that on behalf of council.
So it doesn't fall to the chair of infrastructure, no.
I will leave that to council's discretion.
Right.
So, from my personal perspective, my unease comes with clause 4, which is the stormwater network one. I don't think that's anywhere near strong enough. The last government, when they were putting through the 3 waters submission, actually only had 2 waters, if we're honest. Stormwater was kicked out somewhere between 3 and 5 years because it was way too complex. And it worries me that this government is including it without realising there are implications all the way along the stormwater track. So that makes me a little bit nervous. And towards the end, putting aside the treaty reflections, which I think the government will make a call on regardless of what we say, in clauses 30 and 31, I have some unease as well. I guess in 30, we're sort of, by acknowledging, we're sort of accepting that the Crown will have a facilitator or a Crown water specialist who will support councils in reaching agreement and joint agreements. And that by default really means that we'll have a bit of pressure on us to be in a joint agreement. And it doesn't facilitate the option that we may stand alone. So that was one issue. And the other issue is the one in 31, which talks about giving us guidance on templates, information funding and support for building partnerships. Well, the National Transition Unit's already been disbanded. So that'll just be an information drop out of DIA, which, again, I'm not sure that'll be all that helpful.
So I'm happy that we can provide some additional emphasis onto the stormwater piece around the complexity of that area.
Yep.
I'm also conscious that we received a shared submission of a draft submission from our colleagues in Dunedin, and I noted that they put a good piece into their submission which speaks to what you were just talking about,
Yep.
about saying that they are hoping that the intent of the legislation is to be enabling as opposed to setting mandatory requirements and being restrictive on what councils can do to achieve financial stability in the Three Waters space,
Yep.
and encouraging the government to make sure that arrangements are flexible and not prescriptive in, you know, essentially pushing councils down a CCO type path. So I wonder if we might look to include a piece to that effect to cover
Well,
off that piece around flexibility.
Again, it's nice to have dreams about what they want to do, but what they put in the legislation is a different ballgame. So I just see that as a point of pressure for us,
Yeah.
that we may or may not need.
We can
So
call
we
that
should
out.
have some choice about that. And I guess the last issue, which I think was raised by Rangi, was, do we need to make an oral submission? So I can tell you, when we went up in the last Three Waters one, under the last government, Rangi and I both went to Dunedin. To be honest, it was a complete waste of time. We had about a third of the committee there, and half of them were out getting coffees and going to the toilet while we were submitting. So I think the government's already got its agenda. If we put it in writing, I don't know how much we'll reinforce by going to Wellington, and I suspect we won't have the ears of the full committee anyway. I think the number of submissions that they will get from people that are politically opposed to all of this means they'll split the committee up. But I'm open to being convinced whether we should go or not. Rangi?
Look, I just want to comment on the chance of this council being forced into some sort of joint venture, CCO, whatever, because the way 17A sits at the moment in the Local Government Act, it calls on council to deliver the most efficient service. Now, that, I mean, we've looked at it before, and coupling up with other councils, does not necessarily deliver the most efficient service. So 17A, we have, well, I believe that is our out, that unless it can be proven, they cannot force us into some sort of combined Southland Otago
Yep.
thing if it's going to be more costly than what we're doing now. And as long as, I mean, they're going to have to change the Local Government Act to be able to enable that.
Yep. So I've sat in, as Thomas sat in, and so has Michael Day, sat in on recent Zoom meetings that we've had around Three Waters, and the potential for a coalition between ourselves and Southland, and between Otago and Southland, and even wider into the Takiwa. There's nothing that's come out of those meetings that has excited me at all. Sorry, Aaron. I know you've had some involvement there, but I just think they're all scrambling. And the key questions about transfer of assets and existing debt and all that sort of stuff is just not there for me at the moment. So if I had to flick a coin tonight, I'd probably say we should stay out. But we're not in that position yet, just got an open mind and listening. But there's a long way to go yet under this potential for a CCO or something similar. Long way to go. And you're quite right, Rangi, if it doesn't suit our ratepayers, we should not go in under New Zealand Inc. or Otago Southland Inc. or anything else. Got to do what's right for our ratepayers.
Absolutely.
So clarification on that, Chair, so for me.
Sorry?
You did say CCO there, but my reading of what we've got so far is it could be a joint committee. Is that
Sorry?
right? Is it could be a joint committee. There's no requirement, I don't think,
No.
for it to be
Talks about partnerships.
a CCO. It's a,
Yep.
it's a partnership.
Yep.
Problem with CCO is that councillor basically loses control. It's like electricity in Invercargill. How much control do we have of that? You know, it's a concern for me.
Yep. Leslie?
Yes, you invited comments on the question of an oral submission, so I just
Yep.
wanted to make the comment that if council actually thinks that this is a highly important issue, which we have certainly indicated we do at endless discussions around this table in the last few years,
Yep.
then I would suggest if you don't make an oral submission, you might as well admit that you are caving in and not even bother putting in a written submission.
Yep.
The fact of the matter is, these are the issues on which, if council considers it that important, you appear before a select committee with an oral submission, or why are you bothering?
Yep. Ria?
I support what Councillor Soper said. The thing with submissions, and a lot of submitters make the mistake of when they come to select committee, is they just go over the document that they've given to the select committee to read over. I would recommend that you have your best technically astute person to go along and give them the facts of how it affects our water directly. I think that's really important. Yes, members are going to the toilet. Yes, they are having coffees. They're listening to hundreds of submissions each day. So we have to be like quite niche in how we deliver what we want them to hear, and it's the best technical person to do that. Talk at their level as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Expand on the submission. Don't go and read it.
Don't bore them.
No, well, I mean,
Be
I've done
precise.
some of these before, and look, you get 10 minutes if you're lucky. So it's no good going and reading 31 points, because you'll get halfway through.
No, that's what I'm saying.
Yep.
You know, the best technical person's the best one to go.
Yep. All right. So, we've got some recommendations. I'll come back to the oral submission towards the end, which is option 3. But if somebody would like to move 1 and 2. Trish? Barry, thank you. All those in favour?
Aye.
Carried. The last issue is the issue whether we should lodge a submission, or as part of lodging the submission, whether we should take the advice of making an oral submission as well. I'll work on the affirmative, that being the affirmative that we should. And so all those in favour of us lodging an oral as well?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? None. And then comes back to I'm open to a discussion on who should be there.
Well, as Councillor Bond said, if we believe the issue is of the importance we seem to have been indicating for years that we do, we should have someone with the technical ability to expand on the important points in our submission, and therefore I would suggest that a senior staff member, executive team member is probably the most appropriate person we can delegate.
I'd second that.
So run that past me again. Who are you recommending?
I would suggest if Erin is able to do so, that
Yep.
that would be the senior person we could send.
Would suggest perhaps Michael and I could decide between whether it's Michael or myself.
Yeah.
I was gonna, I was going to say they do. Often the CEs will actually be there technically supported by their technician person, which probably would be the best way to go about that.
Reasonable to assume that we only need one person, to be honest. Look, we're only going to be there for 10 minutes, and that includes the questions that are asked of us. There will be so many people submitting, there really will be, that we only need one person there that can speak to some of the key bits that we might get questions to. So you just go there and you say, our submission, we accept it's been read. And then we just like to reinforce number 8 and number 13, and then you throw the questions out and they'll come back to you on what they want.
So
And
could
they always
I,
ask some questions.
could I suggest, as happy as I would be to do it, I also think that you want a seniority that speaks
Yep.
to the weight of influence that you're
Of course.
wanting to have in the matter.
Yep.
So my suggestion would be the chief executive or the mayor. And so happy if Michael's happy as the chief executive. I think given Michael's close involvement with this issue in his previous role, he's got that technical capability to be able to speak to it as well.
I'm happy to change my recommendation to say the CEO
Yep.
with obviously
And
with
look,
the
I'm
strong
quite-
backing of the executive leadership team
Yep.
and preparing.
I'm quite happy to do that because, again, I can't speak to any of the technical stuff. Even though I've had a long history of bashing away at Three Waters. The technical questions are what they'll want to know. They're going to get so many admissions that are just on general stuff anyway, and which is the policy stuff about iwi involvement and other stuff. They'll have thousands on that. So yeah, I'm happy to move that. Evelyn?
Yes, I just would like to say, even though you only need one person to speak, I think the optics of the senior leadership of the city sitting united, even if one of them doesn't speak, is really what it is. I know that usually we don't dwell on the optics of it, but if we want to be taken seriously with what we're saying, the mayor and the CE or the mayor and the director of infrastructure have a lot more impact than just one person. And I know that seems really silly, but I've sat through submissions and I look who presents, and I take how they come quite seriously. If they just send somebody junior in the organisation who flounders a bit, you don't take them as seriously if it's the chair of the group and the
You don't.
financial officer or whatever, you know. We want people to listen to what we're going to say on this, and I think the optics are important this time.
Leslie, you were the one that put that nomination up?
Well, I was being fiscally
Yes, I know.
responsible in suggesting one person, but if the feeling of the table is two people, I would certainly agree the optics of
Yep.
a second person who's also an expert is useful and can sometimes assist if
Sway.
there is an odd, out of left field question that can be answered on the spot but
Yep.
might not have otherwise been answered. And because there are two people there, then, yep, I'm happy for it to be both those people.
I'd second that.
Okay, well, from my end, it's not a money issue. This is probably the most important issue we'll face in this term, and probably last term as well. So it's important that we have the right voice. I'll put both nominations, myself and Michael, to go. If that's defeated, I'll happily go just to Michael. I won't take any offence to that. So all those in favour of two of us going?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? Yep, done. Sorry, Michael.
Get a pound.
I get the window seat, just out of curiosity. All right, I think that's us done, isn't it? Somebody would like to move that we close for the day?
Out of committee.
Oh. Yep. Leslie, end the meeting. Darren, a second. Well done, Barry, you smiled. Your second, all those in favour?
Aye.
Carried, thank you for your input. We're done.
Thank you, and apologies again for the short notice.